Hi, I'm Steve Carlson, 2014 Minnesota nominee for U.S. Senator and Independent's 2016 candidate for president. As I address the state of the purity of federal elections in Minnesota, the ability of the voters, through a free and fair expression of their will, to choose a candidate of their choice, not of the choice of a small coterie of DFL insiders or a rigged quota system, or ineffective Republican leadership which is falling to the demagoguery of Barack Obama. I will tell you straight up that democracy has been suspended in Minnesota through a series of corrupt government actions by Minnesota officials and interference in constitutionally established procedures designed to challenge this corruption. And this came about because of a conspiracy between Democrats and Republicans, the duopoly, to eliminate the competition of a third party, an independent party, the expression of the will of independent voters. This party is a residual party of Ross Perot's in 1992, so you can see how long it has been around. And I want to speak to you about the phenomenal role of Trump and Sanders as independent candidates, seriously challenging the establishments of the Republicans and the Democrats, and the opportunity this creates for us, the independent voters, playing a huge role. Then how long can this go on? Because we see that the two establishments, the Democrats and Republicans, agree on most things, and together have gotten us into a big jam, a jam with the debt, with health care, with lack of opportunity for education, the lack of jobs, and for national security. And so we need to take advantage of this opportunity. And one more point I want to make before I read from the letter to the Senate outlining how democracy has been suspended in Minnesota, and that the Supreme Court has put its stamp of approval on this. It shows that all the states and the two parties duopoly of the Democrats and Republicans, that duopoly, can carry this out, if they're not already doing so, in every state in the country. One of the big problems is the gender quotas, the gender boosting that Hillary Clinton is relying on right now. While the independent voice is strong in 2016, reflecting the fact that the majority of voters this year identify as independents and not with the Democrats or Republicans, it's obvious that the ideas discussed during the campaign cannot be carried out with the current U.S. Congress. Bernie Sanders' great FDR-like plan is not going to pass this Congress. That Congress needs to be replaced. He's an independent. He's not a Democrat. He's going against the Democrats. Democrats and Republicans will vote against Bernie Sanders' ideas. They'll block the Bernie Sanders plan, which needs to be discussed. But it can't be passed unless you, the independent voters, the majority of the 2016 voters, not only examine these two presidential candidates and their platforms, and also other independent candidates such as myself, but vote for a whole new slate of members of the U.S. Senate who are up for election and of the U.S. House of Representatives. These are strongly gerrymandered districts, these U.S. House districts, what with the changing voter composition, as people are leaving the Democratic Party to become independent people, are leaving the Republican establishment to become independent. So the gerrymandering doesn't matter this year. If you respond, if you participate, you will alter the composition of the Congress as well as make a big change for the better in the White House. The same can be said of Donald Trump. He's facing fierce opposition to simply solving some of the long-standing problems which everybody in the country knows are there. If he were to be elected, he would need a whole new Congress. So independent voters, vote, run, organize, and take this country back. Now I'll start here talking to the Secretary of the U.S. Senate, whose office received and did not respond to a properly filed notice of contest which was being illegally blocked in Minnesota courts at the time from reaching the Senate. So there was a change from the Democratic Senate, as they lost the Senate, to the Republicans. And so this person has a history of working with Mitch McConnell, but probably the blame for dropping the ball on this challenge to severe constitutional violations in federal elections lies with Governor Mark Dayton and Mark Ritchie, as I will explain. This letter and report to the U.S. Senate, which follows an exhaustive and diligent pursuit of all election law remedies in the Minnesota and U.S. Supreme Court. The letter deals with constitutional issues protecting the right to vote. The Senate is the sole judge of this election contest, according to Article 1, Section 5 of the U.S. Constitution, while Section 4 of the same Article 1 gives the Senate the absolute constitutional duty, and this lies in the House too, to protect the right to vote. Your vote, my vote, and also the selection of candidates so that you would want to vote for them. That issue was settled by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case regarding John B. Anderson, another independent, when he ran as an independent against Ronald Reagan. Now we hear so much about voting rights violations, but it's really not true. So it's just rhetoric that the Democrats are using to promote their campaigns. And what they're doing is seriously violating and making a nullity, not only of the vote all over the country and in Minnesota, but in Minnesota they're taking away any possibility to put this in the light of day, so that they can push through another identity politics candidate, which is Hillary Clinton. So here's the report and contest to the U.S. Senate. First, the short note to Julie Adams. She's the Secretary of the Senate. And it's sent on February 10th. I noticed that you assumed office as Secretary on January 6, 2015. On January 26, 2014, I sent documents, including a notice of contest, to the United States Senate related to a pending election contest against Al Franken to your predecessor, Nancy Erickson. I have not heard back from your office. Your office was sent an election certificate for Al Franken unlawfully issued by Governor Mark Dayton December 19, 2014. Since that certificate and cover letter from the governor contained false statements that there was no contest pending, it is possible that your predecessor determined that your office would simply ignore those documents. With this letter and report following a final determination by the U.S. Supreme Court January 11th, denying to me as the contestant the collection of evidence for this contest to the U.S. Senate provided for in Minnesota election law statute 209.12 congressional office, I am bringing this contest to the U.S. Senate now. According to your office's cover letter to then Secretary of State Mark Ritchie, the Franken election certificate is required to, will be returned to the governor for recertification. Please distribute this to all U.S. senators and U.S. Senate committees or groups who have jurisdiction over these matters. Please let me know if there are any more documents required of me or any questions you have. Thank you, Steve Carlson. So let's get into what I'm asking, what I presented to the U.S. Senate. There's a contest of Steve Carlson Independence Party on 2014 certification of Al Franken as U.S. Senator. What has happened in Minnesota from about 2012 to the present, and in the 2014 U.S. Senate general election, is the corruption of this assembly, this United States Senate. There is presently a state of corruption in federal elections in Minnesota that equates to the suspension of democracy, suspension of the Republican form of government which the U.S. Constitution requires the United States guarantee to Minnesota and each of the 50 states. This is the greatest abuse of power and betrayal of the Constitution, in particular the right to vote, in the history of the Supreme Court, since it supported slavery and denied the application of the Bill of Rights to the people of the United States. What I'm asking for is to return the certificate of Al Franken to Governor Mark Dayton, with instructions to complete the contest pending at the time he unlawfully issued it. See description of Coleman versus Franken infra as an authority for that. Now further, to hold hearings and collect evidence on the grounds in the contest I sent to this body December 26, 2014, including inter alia, voter quotas in delegates, manipulation and deprivation of public information to use in communicating with voters during an election, taking the money out of politics, and refusal of the courts to allow this body to address its own returns members in elections under Article 1, Section 5, U.S. Constitution. Further, whether under HAVA, Help America Vote Act, the voter emails collected should be public. Whether under the equal time provisions of the Communications Act, the duopoly parties can conspire to totally exclude candidates from a major political party that is a third party from all publicly broadcast debates, and why the Supreme Court would not do its duty of ensuring that state courts comply with the prescribed contest procedures under Article 1, Sections 4 and 5 of the Constitution, and the various issues in constitutional and statutory requirements which were not recognized and followed in this Franken case. The Minnesota Independence Party, IP, is the remnant of the greatest anti-incumbency, anti-establishment, anti-duopoly movement led by Ross Perot since Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. Third parties are an inconvenience for the Democrat and Republican parties, and the attack, which is the subject of this election contest, on the freedom of association of independent voters and independent and third parties and their candidates, that is to say, the IP, by a state governor and his party, joined by the opposition Republicans in Minnesota, is a strong move back to the status quo ante. Specifically, the elimination of all opposition to the two major national parties in federal elections in Minnesota, and was openly celebrated and hoped for by Republican spokespersons on Minnesota media during the 2014 general election. As a result of the violations enumerated here of Minnesota election law and U.S. Constitution in both the 2012, but especially the 2014 elections, this duopoly has succeeded in removing the party as a major political party under Minnesota election law, and a spot on the general election ballot enjoyed by the party since 1992. Further, by tampering with Minnesota election law to allow future illegal activity by the governor or secretary of state, a state of suspension of the Republican form of government in Minnesota has occurred, and this body needs to address it to guarantee, as is your constitutional duty, a Republican form of government, and to protect the right to vote. Beyond the special circumstances of Minnesota, a systematic discrimination against white males, whites, and straight voters is being imposed by the entire Democratic National Committee in Philadelphia in 2016, resting on systems of discrimination required to be put in place by each of the 50 states. In Minnesota, however, this clearly involves state action, and I explain. But with or without state action, the imposition of quotas by the party for each state is a massive violation of the Constitution. See, for example, Smith versus Allwright, Supra. A challenged election law, Minnesota Statute 202A.16, gives these principles of discrimination the force of state law, forbidding even the participation of those who disagree. And that law is who may participate and vote. Subdivision 2, agreement with party principles. Only those persons who are in agreement with the principles of the party as stated in the party's constitution, this is a state law, state statute, and who either voted or affiliated with the party in the last state election or intend to vote in the future election may vote at the precinct caucus. And under subdivision 3, decision by caucus vote, in case the right of a person to participate at the caucus is challenged, the question of the right to participate shall be decided by the vote of the whole caucus. The person so challenged may not vote. And if you look at the Democratic Party constitution, you can challenge based on failure to comply with gender division or any kind of proportional representation on the basis of gender, race, sexual practices, or any kind of group thing, so that eventually the vote of white males to even be allowed to participate gets whittled down to about 35 to 40% of that caucus and the state convention. So they cannot have any effective role in endorsing a nominee who then goes on the general election ballot. Now in Minnesota, people like Mark Dayton himself, he was defeated because of this. Because he's a millionaire many times over, he was able to use his own money to just buy his way and beat the endorsed candidate, which is very difficult to do with the entire DFL party fighting against you in a primary election. So this is the kind of thing which is being talked about here. And I'm going to get some more detail. A tremendous ideological requirement this is that places a heavy burden on voters wishing to associate to elect a candidate whose own views fit their own. This state requirement backing the DFL principles forces voters out of the party and denies our freedom of association and freedom of expression under the First Amendment. In addition, the use of voter quotas for voting delegates, limiting the number of delegates of various, really all status identities, such as blacks, minorities, women, and notably white males, straight white males, such as myself, by requiring reasonable proportionality with presence in the Minnesota population of the status among voters. And so this violates outright the 15th Amendment, which forbids the abridgment or denial of the right to vote based on sex of anybody. And actually, that's of race, of anybody. So it's not just the black vote, it's the white vote, it's any vote that you cannot be limited, abridged, or denied your right to vote in nominating a candidate for the ballot on the basis of your race. And it also violates the 19th Amendment, which forbids the abridgment or denial of the right to vote based on the sex of anybody. It didn't give women the right to vote. It said no one can be denied that right based on their sex. And yet we have people pushing back and now taking away the votes of the former majority, the present majority. The voter quota practices also violate the First Amendment freedom of expression and association of those voters who are eliminated by this unconstitutional practices from casting their vote in the nomination process and associating with the other delegates because of their sex or race. And it heavily burdens the rights of all voters who cannot vote for a candidate whose policy preferences lie outside the parties allowed. So if they want to vote for somebody as a Democrat, but who is eliminated because of their sex or their race, they can't vote for that person, and that heavily burdens their voting right. And the authority for that is Anderson versus Calabrese from 1983, U.S. Supreme Court case. Anderson addressed those voters whose preferences are outside the Democrats or Republicans, but both parties have borrowed liberally from the case. For instance, Toshjian versus Republican Party, dealing with the GOP in 1986, and Eo versus San Francisco County Democratic Central Committee in about the same year, to claim their own rights of freedom of association, as if this guarantees their rights to associate, but no longer says anything about independent voters. And in fact now is being used to justify, has been used in federal court to justify these voter quotas, eliminating white males from nominating the final, the nominee, the endorsed nominee for any federal office. President, senator, U.S. representative, it's all rigged. Now in this case, a party that has been defaced because your own image. Okay, so we're talking about the Democrats defacing the party because you as a white male are no longer, because of your sex and your race and other status characteristics, your image has been taken off that party and no longer can possibly represent you. Even if you can win the points and get your people out to vote, you're not going to be included, except in a small minority, restricted minority, abridged minority. So even Democrats or independents who want support of their views from that Democratic Party now are pushed out and they lie outside that party. And so it's a violation of freedom of association under the First Amendment, per Anderson. Now those circumstances in Minnesota which have resulted in the elimination of the third major party and also in the suspension of democratic elections as required by the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, requiring this body's intervention, include efforts to stop any debate of the voting rights issues raised in the campaign against me by my opponent Betty McCollum when I stood as the IP nomination in the U.S. House, CD4 Minnesota in 2012. As a result, the Secretary of State, who was Mark Ritchie, abused his power to stop the use of voter email addresses submitted to and collected by his office under the HAVA, Help America Vote Act statute passed by this body. So I could not fight these voter quotas and direct emails during the election to all the CD4 voters who had voluntarily submitted their email address while voting and while registering. Sometimes there's same-day registration. Now there followed a failed federal case to enjoin this unconstitutional action in the last days of the 2012 election, and the blocking by Minnesota courts of a contest filed then to address this violation. When I won a statewide primary for U.S. Senate in 2014, then appeared again at the top of the statewide ballot, this time against Al Franken, who sued his way into this body in 2009 in an election contest against Norm Coleman. Mr. Franken and his party and the Minnesota courts took a number of ever stronger actions to prevent this blatant unconstitutionality from surfacing and being challenged either in the press or in any face-to-face debate with him, which was my right as the elected major political party nominee. The purported justification given, all or virtually all of the U.S. senators are Democrats or Republicans, so an Independence Party candidate would not be admitted. Further, the Minnesota courts, dominated by partisans and candidates of the DFL and Minnesota GOP, refused to follow the law. First, to allow the filing of a contest, blocking it in both 2012 and 2014. And I give some of the details in the letter. Now, because of the election law in Minnesota, Minnesota Statutes 209.12 Congressional Office Contest, this matter needed to be brought first to Minnesota courts, but only for a specific function by the courts, which the Minnesota courts and officials, including Senator Franken, deliberately and systematically abused. For under ancient law regarding rights of people's assemblies like this one and the precedent of Stephen L. Morgan versus the U.S. 1986, each house shall be the judge of the elections. This, by the way, is reading from the Constitution. Returns and qualifications of its own members, unquote. The provision from Morgan states not merely that each house may judge these matters, but that each house shall be the judge, emphasis added. The exclusion of others, and in particular of others who are judges, could not be more evident, unquote. That's from Morgan, written by Justice Scalia on the appellate court at that time. So this is a clear violation, and our courts are blatantly interfering in the outcome of federal elections, contests, and deliberately aiding the imposition of heavy burdens on the very independent voters which the U.S. Supreme Court in Anderson identified in 1983. In that case, a member of the U.S. House, displeased with the success of Ronald Reagan, split off and began his own independent movement. He did not do as well as Ross Perot in 1992, nor as well as Teddy Roosevelt did in 2012. He achieved 6% virtually across the board in every state, with the aid of the First Amendment and the Supreme Court. In the year 2000, John Anderson ran with the Reform Party, the same party as Donald Trump and Jesse Ventura, and the party I ran with. It changed its name to Independence Party in Minnesota. But that party today has lost the protection which was provided not only by the Supreme Court, but by the U.S. Constitution. The Supreme Court emphasized the Supreme Court, I don't want to be like Marco Rubio here, but it's a technological problem here. But the Supreme Court made it very clear that the rights which have now been lost to us reside most importantly in the independent voters, not a political party, not any party, not the Independence Party, but the voters. And I can read directly from the court on that. Now, this contest and report to the U.S. Senate is concerned with restoring and protecting the freedom of association. In this case, in contest before you in Minnesota, freedom of association in the form that has been clearly and explicitly intended by the U.S. Constitution, by the First Amendment, has been virtually destroyed. Many people, no doubt, many senators are promoting many ideas about elections. New technology to facilitate multi-party voting, to build political pluralism, restoring the vote to felons, registering naturalized citizens to vote, even protecting the integrity of the voting system by voter ID, or overturning Citizens United, repealing really the First Amendment to put control of finances in your hands. All of these ideas to modify voting are not as important as protecting the right to vote of the voters. This is a voting rights case. The U.S. Constitution puts this power to prescribe the manner of elections of U.S. senators in the states, now numbering 50, through Article 1, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution. Through Section 5 of the same article, the Constitution gives this body the duty to protect that through passing laws as well as serving as judges of the validity of the election of its members. There's also a great deal of talk about taking the money out of politics, including a tax on Citizens United. But in this case, the state of Minnesota, through its DFL leadership, has specifically prohibited taking money out of election politics by manipulating the use of public information so that it will specifically benefit the major parties, and specifically one party. When former Secretary of State Mark Ritchie took voter email addresses collected by his office as Chief Elections Officer and used them to raise funds for himself and his party. And I was told in 2010 and 2012 by the OSS, Office of Secretary of State itself, without seeking it, that I could purchase the voter email addresses by paying for a disc. In 2012, I did, but not until I had begun this argument about voting rights by recording and uploading a campaign video called Make It Count as part of Wrap the Vote. Then the rules were quickly and arbitrarily changed by the DFL state officials running the election. So I'm going to stop this video now and go on to video 2, which is about what is the role of the courts and the role of the U.S. Senate in protecting the vote. But before I do, I want to point out that Chief Justice John Roberts appeared before the New England Law Boston. That's a law school in Boston called New England Law. And he claimed that the court is not in favor of any particular policy decision. It's just there to allow other branches to decide. It's not up to them. And Robert Barnes, who wrote the story, started to talk about hot-button policy issues. And then this was shortly after they denied further consideration of this case that I'm bringing to the Senate. And what I just want to say is that the people are the political institution which have to be honored here. But also the Senate has a role. And if the court is going to refuse to carry out its role, this body really has to step up and to protect the right to vote, which is enshrined directly, as I'll get into in the second video, which is directly enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 4. And I'll go over a string of cases, including Ex parte Yarborough, U.S. versus Classic, referred to even in some Minnesota case, and I think Bush v. Gore actually goes there as well, perhaps in the dissent. But it's good law. The right to vote does not need to be passed by anybody, and even though the states may regulate it, it has to be regulated by the Constitution, and by Congress. And I'm asking Congress to regulate it and to step in this case and make sure that the law is being followed. I'm Steve Carlson. I'm running for president in 2016. Thank you for watching.